will. So please turn over with me to John chapter 9. John chapter 9. Last week we talked about the whole thing in chapter 8. And we looked at it in kind of an overview way because I wanted you to see what John was doing with the structure about, remember, who's your daddy? Okay? And it's easy to get lost in some of the details that John said and not see where he's going or where is Jesus going with that lesson. The Jewish religious leaders needed to hear some things from Jesus. And they had trouble hearing them. And so he says it over and over again in a different way. If you go back to John chapter 8, it's important to know that this is all connected. In John chapter 8, in verse 12, he says, when Jesus spoke again to the people, he said, I am the light of the world. Whoever follows me will never walk in darkness, but have the light of life. Now, why is that important? Because Jesus is going to repeat that in chapter 9. This was already talked about in chapter 1 of John. In him was life, and that life was the light of men. Okay? The idea that Jesus is what we were supposed to be. He illuminates what we're supposed to know about God. We look at Jesus and we see God. Now we've seen John approach that from different ways. When Jesus uses the term, before Abraham was, I am. If you look at me, you see God. You see me, you see the Father. You know the Son, you know the Father. Over and over again. Well, they don't get it. Okay? They don't get it. And so we're going to do more of that in chapter 9. But before we do, there are some important things in chapter 8 that we just kind of skimmed over because they weren't important to where Jesus was going at the time. But we have a tendency to get lost in some of these details, and I don't want to just pretend like they're not there. Jesus said some things in that lesson in chapter 8 about who's your daddy that we need to talk about. He made mention that those who sin are a slave to sin. I told you there's a whole Sunday's worth of sermons there, a whole month of Sundays worth of sermons there. But I think it's important that we acknowledge that this is what Jesus believes. It's not a matter of, when you think of sin, you think of something that kind of sounds good, but I'm not supposed to do it. Right? It looks good, matter of fact, it really looks good in the movies and on TV, but I'm not supposed to do it. Maybe I can get away with it sometimes. Maybe it's not as bad. When you're talking about sin, you're talking about missing the mark. Not being what you're created to be. That's what the word sin means. If you don't believe what Jesus said, then you don't have the right perspective of sin. If you don't believe that you could be a slave to it, then you really don't understand sin. Now we say, okay, now, we know that people can get addicted, right? We know overuse of alcohol to become drunk, right? We know you could be addicted to alcohol, and we say that's terrible. And then we've seen people deal with that and struggle with that. And you can become a slave to alcohol, right? Where it controls your life, you don't control it, it controls you. We say, drugs. We see people who are addicted to drugs. That's bad. What about the other ones? What about outbursts of anger? Can it be possible that your anger controls you and you don't control your anger? That's what Jesus is saying. What about things like gossip? Is it possible that gossip can control you and you can't control Gossip? What about hatred? What about that whole list of sins in Galatians 5:19? Sexual immorality, impurity, debauchery, witchcraft, hatred, discord, jealousy, fits of rage, selfish ambition, dissensions, factions, envy. Do you understand that those things can control you, even when you think you're in control? Jesus says, you're a slave to sin if you sin. Now, guess what? That makes all of us. Right? That makes all of us. And we need the Son to set us free, like he said. We talked about that last week. Right? Unless you really don't believe that you are a slave to sin. Unless you really have fooled yourself and think that you are in control of your life. Now, if you do, that's when Jesus talks about lies. Remember he talked about you guys are children of the devil, Satan. And he's a liar. And the father of lies. When he speaks lies, he speaks his native language. This is the other truth that we need to talk about in what Jesus said. And there's important things to know about this, because people will attribute power to Satan that he does not have. People will try to make you live in fear of Satan. The Bible, the word Satan literally means he's the accuser. He's the accuser. He goes around accusing you. Not everything he says is a lie, but he accuses you, okay? He said he was a murderer. All he wants is murder and lies, and that's what he has. If you live in the truth, then you don't have to live in fear of Satan. That's really important, because all the Halloween material is out there already. I love to study cultures. I'm still working on our culture here. Okay? But there's something about Halloween and fear. And we love to dabble on the edge of fear. We even put ourselves in situations that are just downright scary, where someone will jump out and scare you. And sometimes we do that just so we can feel like we're alive. Do you ever wonder why people go to scary movies? And go to horror houses and those things that, sometimes just so they can feel like, yeah, they're alive. My heart still works. It's still beating. Boom, 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 boom. Okay? Others of us say, we don't want to go anywhere near that. Right? Well, your heart should work. Your heart should work. God can take a heart of stone and make it into a heart of clay. He can let you feel love and joy and peace and patience and kindness and goodness and gentleness and faithfulness and self-control. He can let you feel those things. We don't have to resort to scaring people with Satan. Let me just put it that way. Okay? If you give Satan more than he is due, then you're not doing yourself any favors. He is not a contestant to be God. He's not even in the running. God is God, and there is no other, including you, including me. And we come to worship to acknowledge that God is God and we're not. And that's the definition of worship. Okay, these are some things that Jesus mentioned in chapter 8 when he was talking about you don't see, you're living in darkness. You're living a lie. And if you don't believe that sin can control you, you are living and swallowing a lie. If you really think you're in control of your life, then you're living in that fantasy land called lie.